What's up, guys? Welcome back. I've been studying through a passage in Matthew that I saw something and I just had to share it. So, hope you're excited to dig into it. I'm going to be picking up in Matthew chapter 6. I'm reading from the New International Version. I find it a little bit easier to read through, but you use whatever version you have. Matthew chapter 6, verse 1 says, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full." And this is Jesus speaking. So when he says they have received their reward in full, he would know. He says, "But when you give to the needy," and this is the part that stuck out to me, "do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full." There it comes again. "But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think that they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him." Let's go ahead and we'll open with a quick word of prayer and we'll dig right in. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for bringing us all together on this platform to study your word. I pray that you open our eyes, our ears, and our hearts to see what you would like us to learn today. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. All right, let's get digging into it. So as I was studying this passage, that one phrase stood out to me. Do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. So when you give to the needy, Jesus says, do it so that you keep your left hand out of it entirely. What does that even mean? Why does it matter? And what kind of biblical sleight of hand is this that Jesus is commanding us to do? What kind of magic are we talking about? So we know that Jesus at this point is talking about helping somebody out of an act of compassion for others. And he makes this reference to it coming from your right hand. And he wants you to not let your left hand even know about it. Culturally, this is relevant, right? Everything in the Bible comes back to culture. But I would say culturally it was relevant, but culturally it still is. Because how often do we use references like that today? I mean, think about it. He's my right-hand man. That's the right answer. You have two left feet, using it in a negative way. So what is this cultural significance between the right hand and the left hand that Jesus is talking about here? So this reference to it being the right hand is referenced 161 times in the Bible. There's 161 specific references to this phrase right hand. Comparing that to what we see when it references left hand, it's only 11 times. 161, 11. It's a big difference. So obviously there's something behind it. And now historically we've always thought like, oh, the right hand means strength. The right hand means power. But why? Well, because the majority of the world's right-handed, which is true. Across every race and every ethnicity, it's the one thing we definitely have in common. We tend to be predominantly right-handed. But that's not it. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. Where does this reference to strength and power and dominance come from? And why is it our right hand is predominantly the strongest? So I believe as you dig through, and I'll give you some verses for this as well, but the more we dig into it, we realize, yes, the right hand is what God uses to talk about his strength and his power, but only because of the source of where it comes from. The right hand is used to signify authority. Kind of like being the right hand of a king, sitting upon the right hand of the Father in heaven. It's talking about this authority. and recognizing the authority by which the power and the strength come from. In Exodus 15, verse 6, it says, "Your right hand, O Lord, has become glorious in power. Your right hand, O Lord, has dashed the enemy in pieces." In Psalms 110, verse 1, it says, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." And then we see again in Genesis, this had an even deeper significance in Genesis, where it says, Genesis chapter 48, verse 17 through 19, says, "When Joseph saw his father placing his right hand on Ephraim's head, he was displeased. So he took hold of his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. Joseph said to him, 'No, my father, this one is the firstborn.'" He thought his dad's old and blind at this point. You got it wrong. "Put your right hand on his head." But the father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He too will become a people, and he too will become great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a group of nations." Will become greater. The one I placed my right hand of blessing on is the one that will become greater. But I think if we really start to dig in to see the difference in this verse, so we've talked, it talks about power, it talks about strength, it talks about authority, and it talks about greatness coming from the right hand, not the left. And in some cultures, this is extremely relevant. There are some cultures you go to, for example, in Ghana, the culture of extending anything to hand somebody something with your left hand is considered inappropriate. It's considered offensive. You don't point at anyone with your left hand either, because that's considered your dirty hand, the bathroom hand, if you get what I'm saying. Whereas your right hand would be one that you would extend a gift. Culturally, all around the world, right hands bear more significance than left hands. And I think we start to really begin to see the difference and the significance behind this between the left and the right hands if we look at the following verse. In Ecclesiastes chapter 10, pick up in verse 2. I'm going to read 2 verses there. It says, "The heart of the wise inclines to the right. But the heart of a fool to the left. Even as fools walk along the road, they lack sense and show everyone how stupid they are." So the heart of the wise inclines to the right, the heart of the fool to the left. So that gives us an even better understanding at that point then that the right hand is typically referring to authority and wisdom. The left is used as a reference to what's foolish. So let's reread the passage we started with in Matthew chapter 6. In verse 1, he says, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen of them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy," we're talking about giving, right? Helping others, helping with compassion. "When you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others," because that's what they would do. If they had a gift and they were going to give to the needy, the righteous hypocrites, your churchy folk back in the day, they would literally march down the street with somebody playing a trumpet ahead of them and announcing that they're going to give to the needy. So that all the attention, everyone's watching them, and they get that praise and that recognition, right? And men crave recognition. That's the one thing that's also, it's universal. The old saying that babies cry for it and men die for it. Men crave recognition. God knows this. That's why Jesus gave us very specific instructions at this point to say, don't be like the hypocrites, playing a trumpet when you go to give to the needy. That's not the point. If you do, you have your reward in full. Why is there any point in God rewarding you for something you've already been rewarded for? So he picks up here and it says, "Truly I tell you, they've received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." So today I want to study this sleight of hand. that we are instructed to perform when it comes to helping somebody in need, somebody who needs our help. Instead of extending the left hand to them, helping them to make ourselves feel better, helping them to feel like we were a good Christian today, to get the honor and the praise of men, we are to allow the right hand to do the work and not even let the left hand know about it. That hand, the right hand, refers to authority, but whose authority? Typically, if you're a king and it's the right hand of the king, it's the king's authority on which you're acting. And Jesus is saying, don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing. Your right hand is the right hand of authority, but you're doing this for who? If you're doing it for yourself, it doesn't matter. You just use your left hand. Get the praise of men. But if you're doing it for me, if you're doing it for God, if you're doing it as a follower of Jesus, then use your right hand. Don't let the left hand know. In yielding to Jesus and his direction, his guidance in our life, we are to extend the right hand to those in need, like he did to us. Have you ever seen those viral videos? I've seen countless videos. A quick search on YouTube, and you'll just see them listed. And they get outrageous. Some 20-something kids out there giving $10,000 or one was $100,000. Where are these kids getting this money? Anyway, $100,000 giving that to some homeless man. Okay, it's a great act of kindness. That's a great deed. But the fact that you did it as a part of a social media video and that it has 48 million views, and they're all like that, 48 million, 30 million, 19.2 million. My mind was blown at this, because people love to see acts of kindness. We love to see people doing good. But when the sole purpose of why you're doing it is to gain views, you have your reward in full. What reason is there for God to reward you anymore? And that's what Jesus is saying here. Interestingly enough, too, most of the time, if you watch those videos, they're interesting. You'll almost always see them holding a camera with their right hand and at the same time handing the gift with their left hand. Why? Because, you got to keep that camera stable and get a good shot so that people can see what you're doing. Jesus references these two choices that each of us have between a right hand and a left hand. And it might make sense to understand that Jesus also references his right hand and his left hand as having, that he set that aside, that he reserves his right hand and his left hand for something very specific in the future. Flip over to Matthew chapter 25, and we're going to pick up in verse 31. Matthew 25, verse 31, and we'll read through verse 46. And it says, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats." Verse 33, "He will put the sheep on his right, and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry.'" We're going to get into compassion. "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes to clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go and visit you?" Verse 40 says, "The king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.' Then he will say to those on his left, 'Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you didn't clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me. They also will answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger needing clothes, or sick, or in prison, and didn't help you? He will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. Then they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. We have foolish decisions on the left, right, that result here in a rejection of Jesus Christ. And that self-serving pattern of behavior that desires the praises of other men. We see the end result of that decision. Jesus rejects them in the final judgment, and they're sorted as goats to his left. Compare that to making a decision to recognize him as the governing authority in your life. And he recognizes you on the day of judgment. Right? Jesus says that many times throughout the scriptures. He tells us that if we acknowledge him, he will acknowledge us before his Father in heaven. If we're ashamed of him, he will be ashamed of us before the Father in heaven. So, did you notice that the last thing he said in that passage, which is often referenced from the pulpit, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this in different sermons, and it drives me crazy because it's almost always out of context, but it is a very popular passage. But typically what you'll hear instead of this passage, where he specifically goes into talking about acts of compassion and taking care of other people, and the least of these, my brothers and sisters, as acts done to him, you'll typically hear this preached instead from Matthew chapter 7, verse 21 and 23, like 21 through 23, where it says, not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father, which is in heaven. And I'm reading the King James because that's typically where you're going to hear this preached like this. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name? And in thy name have cast out devils, and in thy name done many wonderful works. And then I will profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye who work iniquity. Okay, now, unfortunately, most of the sermons I've ever heard about this, they miss the point entirely. The verse is used out of context to condemn sinners, so to speak, which is anyone that the church deems is more sinful than they are, because, I don't know, we are all sinners. Paul says in Romans, there's none righteous, no, not one. So this is kind of like a battering ram. We use this verse that I never knew you, depart from me, you who work iniquity, that you're so afraid to hear that on that day when you die and you stand before your maker, and Jesus tells you one of two things. The thing you don't want to hear, depart from me, I never knew you. You want to hear, well done, thy good and faithful servant, right? So they use this verse to drill home some standards of expectation, that what a good Christian should do and what a good Christian looks like. And it typically involves a few, we'll say, rules or regulations, bylaws, standards, whatever you want to call it in your church. Typically, the first one is be in church whenever the doors are open. Be in church. That's not biblical. We are called to be the church, not be in church. We are the church. So that makes no sense. What they're saying is to be in the building whenever they open the doors. Okay, sure, I understand where that's coming from, but the next one, and I've hit on this before, piercings are totally unacceptable, unless you're a woman, and then just one piercing right here in the ears, that's acceptable, that's fine. Tattoos are satanic. Can't have tattoos unless they were like prison tats from before you met Jesus and got saved. Then that's fine. All contemporary music's bad. Anything with a beat, that's just unacceptable. If the music sounds good, then they'll know how much we can't sing. I really don't understand where that comes from, these traditions, but carry on. alcohol's straight out of the pits of hell because everyone knows that Jesus drank Welch's grape juice. Men must be clean shaven, have short hair. I'm out. That's not going to work for me. Women must have long hair. How about dress in a certain way? We're always told you have to dress a certain way. Wear your Sunday best when you come to church. But what they really mean by that, the standard for a good Christian is going to be women can never wear pants. They always must wear a skirt. And men, you obviously need to conform to the style that Jesus dressed, which is a European style suit that really came to popularity in the 1920s. A suit and tie, because Jesus always wore a tie. That's church. But women wearing nothing but skirts, no pants, can't resemble a man in any way. You hear this in a lot of traditional churches. But put a pin in that, because we're going to come back to that in a minute and find out exactly where that came from. And so at the end of it, if you fail to follow these or any of the many, many more, there's hundreds of them, the regulations and standards, and if you ask anyone in the church, they don't recognize them like that. They don't see that. It's been so ingrained over time. But if you fail to follow any of these, you're at risk of being ostracized and cast out of the church. They will literally say they're going to kick you out of the church. The church is a group of people, not a building, bro. You can't kick me out. You didn't adopt me in. Jesus did. Anyway. But if you commit any of these and you violate any of these rules, you run the risk, according to them, of hearing those terrifying words on that day, your day of judgment. I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity. Well, there's obviously so much wrong with each of these standards that I listed, and it's important to note, none of them are biblical. None of them are rooted in Jesus' teaching or in the Bible at all. And they twist scripture in order to try to make it fit. And you got to do some really good mental gymnastics to get there. But talking about this sleight of hand, it's interesting to study just how magically it all came about and by whom it came about. This set of standards you'll find in almost every what's called Independent Fundamental Baptist Church, IFB. Right? Independent, they don't report to anybody. They're independent. Fundamental, they only believe what's in the Bible. And Baptist, because they believe in water's baptism, and that's what they'll tell you. But they teach this kind of stuff as doctrine, when in reality, they're just the commandments of men. Ooh, I misspoke. The commandments of one man, Jack Iles. Now, if you've been in a Baptist church any length of time, you've probably heard the name. Your preacher may have mentioned it. He may have even attended the Hyles Anderson College that Jack Hyles started. Jack Hyles was once one of the biggest pastors. He was the pastor of the biggest church in the country at one point. Over 100,000 members, 20,000 in attendance every Sunday service. And where the format came from. 2 church services on Sunday schools, and then main service, and then that evening a Sunday night service, and then on Wednesdays a service. This format, this is where it came from. Now, he pastored the First Baptist Church in Hammond, Indiana, from 1959 until he died in 2001. Now, in 1972, he founded the Hyles Anderson College, right, which is an unaccredited Bible college, and the sole purpose of it to be able to train other pastors and other ministers and other men of God to go and do thou likewise, right? Go and teach as he taught. So a total of 572. Now this is important. Think about how many churches. Okay, there's 50 states. 572 alumni have gone through this college and then gone on to pastor independent Baptist churches. So nearly every independent, fundamental, and quote-unquote Baptist church has its roots tied back to Jack Hyles in the Hyles-Anderson College in Hammond, Indiana. If they're doing that, if we're going to start teaching what Jack Hyles teaches, then by definition we've stopped teaching what Jesus taught. We've elevated a man above God. We've elevated Jack Hyles above Jesus Christ, and that becomes a problem. And we're going to see exactly how that becomes a problem when we go through a little bit more of a quick little history lesson here on the First Baptist Church in Hammond, Indiana. Following his death in 2001, his son-in-law, Jack Shep, took over the church after receiving a overwhelming 96% of the majority vote. I mean, he had the resume. It made sense. His name was Jack. But his resume boasted 22 years teaching at the Hyles-Anderson College. In 5 years as the vice president of it. So when it was just only natural at that point, when Jack Hyles passed away in 2001, they immediately held a vote to bring his son-in-law in to carry on the legacy. Now, that becomes important because it's important to note that Jack Shep was raised in this culture, in these standards, following these standard rules. From the time he was an infant, his parents took him to a Baptist church. And if you think about it, by that point, Jack Hyles, his influence has already started to spread. The doctrine that Jack Hyles taught was ingrained into him from infancy. That mental mindset, that philosophy of religion. So where is Jack Shep today? Because remember, this is not ancient history. This is 2001. So it's 2022, right? It's not ancient history. It's not like we're talking about World War I and World War II. This is 2001. He gets elected in. He's the pastor. What happens? Jack Shep is currently serving a 12-year prison sentence. He's incarcerated for, at the age of 55, married with 2 children, sexually assaulting a 16-year-old in his church and calling it counseling. Repeatedly. Taking her across state lines because he thought it was legal across state lines. Conducting youth conferences and calling them youth conferences, but they weren't youth conferences. This guy got caught in 2012. But this is a long chain of abuse. Ray gets caught in 2012 and taken to trial and convicted by a judge in 2013 to a 12-year sentence for sexually assaulting a minor. Now, you'd like to say, like, oh, maybe it was a one-off thing, and maybe that's his son-in-law. That's not Jack Hyles. That's not. But yeah, I wish we could do that. We can't do that because if you dig into it, you'll find that Jack Hyles in the First Baptist Church in Hammond, Indiana, has a long line of these allegations. These allegations of sexual assault and molestation of minors and abuse by the church leadership under the leadership of Jack Hyles, they go all the way back. 1989, 1993, 1991. This isn't really uncommon this is kind of par for the course. And I think if you think about it, it makes sense. It makes sense if you're going to start making them rules and regulations that your congregation has to follow. That the women can't look like men. They need to wear skirts. They need to look pretty at all times. And the men need to be men. Men need to dress like Jesus did in suits. King James only kind of church. Not all, and I need to put a disclaimer out there. Not all churches are going to be like that. I am not making the claim that all independent fundamental Baptist churches are broken like this. Or immoral and satanic like that. But they probably don't realize where they got a lot of the traditions that they follow so blindly. Because they didn't do the research on it. They went to a seminary and somebody at seminary told them this is how it's supposed to be done. Most of the time they go to seminary not to learn what's in the Bible. Surprisingly enough, seminary doesn't typically teach you what's in the Bible. It typically teaches you what other men think is in the Bible. How they think you should follow it and how church should operate. Obviously, there's danger then in setting standards that we think Christians ought to follow. especially when they're not biblical and they're not the standards that Christ set for us to follow. The biblical thing, instead of teaching, and I've watched sermons of Jack Hyles, I've watched Jack Shep, their sermons of how ladies need to dress like ladies, and they need to wear skirts, and they need to come down to the middle of their calf, and they need to dress modestly, because if they don't dress modestly, they're going to tempt the men. You can't tempt the men in the congregation. Why? Okay, yes, dress modestly. That is a Christian principle. That's founded in doctrine. You can find that in the scripture. But if the mindset you're using is so that it doesn't tempt men, you're wrong. You're missing the point. Obviously, you didn't catch what Jesus said, right? Because what Jesus said, if you go to Matthew chapter 5, verse 27, he says, "You have heard it said," right? You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." This is Jesus talking. He's teaching. "You shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, bro, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell." In other words, you mean to tell me that it's my fault if I can't control myself because the ladies in my church are dressing in a way that is provocative and tempting me, and it's my fault? Come on, Jesus. That's exactly what he's saying. You are responsible for your own actions, and it matters what's in your heart. So when people are assaulted, when women get assaulted, you typically, the first question another woman asks them is, what were you wearing? What were you doing? You're missing the point. That is not a license, men. That is not a license on anyone to just do whatever they want because, I lost, boys will be boys, which is the dumbest thing you can teach a child. It's the dumbest thing you can say to a young man is boys will be boys. Hold your young men to a higher standard. Teach them to be men. It's clear at this point that Jack Shep never even heard what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 18, right? Verse 6, where he says, "If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me," talking about the children, "to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned into the depths of the sea." Because if that was the option, if you had a choice on your right hand, tie a millstone around your neck and be drowned in the sea, end your life at that point. Or on the left, self-serving interests and whatever is good for me, right? So I'm 55, I've got a family of my own, but this is a 16-year-old girl. And then calling it counseling, going through that, Jesus said it would have been better if you would have tied a millstone around your neck and been drowned in the sea than what you're going to have to deal with when you stand before him. Is the one thing it talks about constantly in the Old Testament, and then Jesus reiterates it in the New Testament. One thing that God hates, right? Hands that shed innocent blood. And then Jesus says, if anyone offends one of these little ones, it'd be better that you were drowned in the sea. The offense of young believers is considered one of the most heinous crimes in the actual doctrine. If you actually study the scriptures, it's the one thing Jesus literally has no tolerance for, as he shouldn't, and as none of us should. Now, the problem with that, Jack Hyles and Jack Shep, they set these standards. All these churches then implement these standards, right? They're independent, but yet they all pretty much go back pointing to Jack Hyles. You can see what camp they're in by just asking them what they believe and what their standards are. So they're not really independent. It's clear at that point then a lot of these churches have implemented these rules. They begin following these standards, following Jack Shep, following Jack Hyles, and they stopped following Jesus Christ. They stopped following what he taught and instead started teaching what these other men taught. A lot of what I say on here is going to, it may offend your modern sensibilities of whatever you think you've been taught in church. I understand that. And what I say on here may run contrary to a lot of what you hear in church. Dear God, I hope so. But what I'm digging into here is I just want to find the truth. What did Jesus teach? Get back to the basics. Minus all the religion and the garbage that we've put on top of it. Get back to the basics. What did Jesus teach? And there's a lot that's revealing if you start studying the life of Christ and what he did. It runs contrary to a lot of what we teach in church too. So it's going to take, I believe, an entire generation. It's going to take an entire generation of men and women rising up and studying the scriptures for themselves and learning what Jesus actually taught and then teaching that correctly, minus an absent religion. Right? This channel is all about heaven without religion. What did the Bible say? What did Jesus say? What did God say? And then go and do that. I believe in order for us to undo the damage that these men have done to an entire generation, I mean, we're talking 1959 to 2001, and then 2001 to 2012. That's a lot of history. Think of the history that went through and the churches that impacted. That's a lot of history and damage to undo. And it's going to take a lot of us to stand up and cry aloud, as it says in the Bible. And even if we are like a man standing in the wilderness, just crying out. But to cry out the truth and to call out the heresy and the blasphemy and the just garbage that we're preaching from pulpits anymore. Anyone can log on to sermoncentral.com and just download a sermon, go and preach that. And you can tell when somebody does that and they haven't actually studied. God help you if you're the man that stands behind a pulpit and you haven't actually studied and you haven't actually prayed and you don't know what God wants you to say. All you know is what Jack Hyles wants you to say. That's a very dangerous predicament to put yourself in. It's a fearful thing to fall in the hands of a living God. We need to be careful that we're not pushing the commandments of men. Like Jesus said, it's the commandments of men. They teach for doctrines the commandments of men. They think I hear them for their many words, but their heart is far from me, right? This is Matthew chapter 15. We need to get back to the basics. That's what this channel is going to focus on. That's why Fed Up Church is so fed up. That's what I'm fed up with. That's why we started this. I'm fed up with the additional garbage. There's no need to add it. It was added by other men, and it doesn't deserve to be there because there's only one man that I will follow, and that man's name was Yeshua. Jesus. That's another thing, too. Interestingly enough, if you've ever heard people refer to him as Yeshua, his name was Yeshua. It wasn't Jesus. It was Yeshua. There's no J sound in Hebrew. So like Jesus, James, John, Jeremiah, you name them, there's no J sounds in Hebrew. It was Yeshua. And Joshua's name was Yeshua. But they thought that would be confusing, so they changed it when they translated it in 1611 for the King James Bible. But anyway, different topic, different time. If you're interested in learning more about that, let me know in the chat, and we'll dig into that another time. So I think in order for us to undo the damage that's been done, it's going to start with us having to extend our hand, our right hand, to people. And stop extending the left hand. Stop extending your hand simply to get something that you want. We all have those friends. We've all known those people, right? Who just only contact you when they need something. Family's great for that. That, you always have those remote family members you never hear from, but like every 9 years, they'll call you up because they need something. Don't be that kind of Christian that only extends a hand when you're expecting something in return, right? That's not an act of kindness. That's an act of business. That's a different kind of transaction. Be the kind of Christian, the kind of disciple of Christ, who then reaches out their right hand and extends a hand of grace, not guilt. A hand of compassion, not comparison. A hand that lifts people up instead of tears them down. We need to edify one another. This is what Paul said. Edify one another. Lift each other up. Build each other up. That's the point. Because the things that happen around us, we're all exhausted. We're all weary. You ask anybody, I don't care who it is, hey, how's it going? They'll say, oh, it's good. But then you ask, no, how are you doing? I'm tired. It's a lot. I'm exhausted. I'm stressed. The kids are doing this. The family's doing this. The job is doing this. My boss expects this. Everybody's going through something. We need to be the kind of person that extends a hand to lift them up, to let them know it's okay. And I'm going through that too. And we can get through this together. That's the point of a church. That's why it says, forsake not the assembling of yourselves together. That's what it means. It doesn't mean go to a building 3 times a week. It means have that connection with somebody, to have that passion for helping them, to love each other as Christ loved us and gave himself for us. Love costs something. Love without sacrifice is not love. That's lust. If it doesn't cost you something, David said he wouldn't build the temple, the land, the fuller's field. When he went for the temple, he went to purchase it. He said, no, I'll give it to you. He said, no, because I will not offer something to my God that costs me nothing. Love must cost something. Love equals sacrifice. That's the proof of the love. And Jesus said to love one another as yourselves. The way we love ourselves, and we'll so easily serve ourselves left-handed, right? He says, love other people that way. Don't even let your left hand know what you're doing. Love other people that way with your right hand. Extend the right hand of gratitude, grace, and love to them. I pray that we become a church that extends our right hand to folks, that we reach out and we lift them up, that we make them better, stronger, more equipped, able to deal with the challenges of the day, that can show them that the Bible is relevant. Because if it's not relevant, it's nothing. It's nothing if it's not relevant. And every time I read through this, I find something that is incredibly relevant to me. The purpose of this channel and this church and why we're doing this is so that I can share this with you as we go through this. If you have any questions, by all means, please ask them. Throw them in the chat. We will definitely address whatever questions you have. And because this is not your typical church setting, we can get away with it. We can get away with asking the questions nobody wants to ask in church, or talking about the history nobody wants to talk about in church. I pray that we are a right hand, that acknowledges Jesus Christ as the one and final authority that he is, that he is the only one that leads us, and that we're a people who recognize where our help comes from when we need it. Like it says in Isaiah. So Isaiah chapter 41, verse 13, and I'm going to end with this. Isaiah 41:13 says, "For I am the Lord, your God. I am the Lord, your God, who takes hold of your right hand and says to you, do not fear. I will help you." If we know where our help comes from, it shouldn't be hard for us to extend a hand, our right hand, to help those who need it. So have an eye of compassion this week. Look for people who need your help. You know where you get your help. Share where you get your help from too. That's what witnessing is. That's what soul winning is. Not going door to door, knocking and advertising and handing out brochures for your church. That's not soul winning. That's marketing, bro. That's a business strategy taught by Jack Hyles. That's not soul winning. You want to win souls to Christ? It happens in the acts of compassion. It happens when you extend your right hand and the left doesn't even know what you're doing. Have an eye of compassion this week. We'll see you next week. Thanks for joining. Love you guys.